Next, Rachel is going to talk a little bit about what's changing and what's continuing in K-12 education given the Common Core. What does that look like in today's classrooms, in next year's classrooms, and in the classrooms 5 years from now, 10 years from now? So, Rachel, thank you.
Make sure it's tall enough, yeah. I don't have to adjust it. Good morning. My name is Rachael Aazzerah. So I want you to think back to 1991, okay? 1991, I was a freshman in high school in this county at Cottage Grove High School. I was sitting similar. Hilda talked about her great niece. I was inspiring at that point. I knew I wanted to teach chemistry. I knew I wanted to teach math and science. In high school, I took quite a few credits here at Lane Community College while I was in high school. I then went on to George Fox and then finished at Oregon State with my bachelor's in chemistry. I then did my master's in science and math ed and my master's in biochem. So I am someone that grew up in this county who was a K through 12 student that went through here. Okay, so we didn't have kindergarten mandatory back then. Okay, so I'm dating myself. I'm getting old, but okay. So I'm also was a middle and high school educator. So for 13 years before I came to the Department of Education, I taught in rural Eastern Oregon, Monument, Oregon. If you know where Monument, Oregon is, it's 70 miles from John Day. There is no cell signal there. You don't have to kidnap cell phones from kids that are not paying attention or using them in the classroom as a learning device because there isn't a cell signal. And I taught math and science in there, as well as I coached and was the vice principal. So what I'm going to show you today is the Common Core State Standards and Smarter Balance assessments of what it's going to be. As Lisa said, when did it start? And we'll talk about that, as well as what's the implementation and eventually to the assessment. So I work in the Department of Assessment at ODE. My official title is Science and Social Science Assessment Specialist. I've also been the Interim Math Assessment Specialist since August. So right now I'm doing the double hat thing. But I really love it, and I love when I get a chance to talk to college and CCWD and higher ed to let them know what's going on in the K through 12 profession and classrooms, because you're going to see a huge switch.
Can you just move that up a little?
I'm sorry.
Can everybody hear okay?
Do I need to turn my teacher voice on?
A little bit.
Okay. So just to let you know, my manager is Derek Brown. He's the manager of Essential Skills. And as you know, in Oregon, students have to master or become proficient to the essential skills. So right now, students, in order to graduate in the state of Oregon, they have to be able to show proficiency in the area of reading and writing. Next year, we'll also integrate mathematics. So, and there's sometimes a misconception that it means they just have to pass a state test, and that isn't true. It means that a student can also show that proficiency with passing the OAKS assessment. There's also multiple ways they can also show that. For example, the PSAT. They can do work samples or local performance tasks in their classrooms. They can take the SAT, the ACT. So there's or the compass, work keys. Thank you. So there's multiple ways they can show those. And as Hilda was talking about in her presentation, there are additional essential skills that have not been implemented. One of them is thinking critically. So for me, for science, that one is not on board yet. But it's something that, in general, we're looking again after the Smarter Balance start. So the spring of 2015, we will need to make sure that we also look at those essential skills that Hilda also discussed and how those will affect the K through 12 classroom. Essential skills is not just at the high school level. So that means students in grades 3 through 8, they also have to show proficiency each year by doing, for example, a work sample in each of those areas. So that means that starting in 3rd grade, a student is expected to show a work sample in reading, in writing, in math, scientific inquiry, as well as writing. So to help them prepare in order to get ready for high school graduation as they go through. So it's not like, oh, you're a freshman, you just are going to start doing the essential skills. No, it's all the way through the system. And then, as you can see, I've also listed Lisa as a contact. So just to talk about Common Core State Standards across the nation, so Hilda referred to in her presentation how many nations have actually adopted the Common Core. And you're going to see a lot of arrows in green representing where Oregon's at, of course. So you'll notice that adopted, pretty much the nation in general. There are a couple states that have not, obviously. And Minnesota has only adopted for the ELA. So that means that they adopted the ELA Common Core State Standards, but they did not adopt the Math Common Core State Standards. They have kept their own set of math standards. Virginia, Nebraska, Texas, and Alaska have not adopted either set. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not incorporating those standards into their curriculum. It just means at the state level, that's not their core curriculum that they're incorporating, that their tests are based on, etc. In Alaska, for example, they've actually talked about joining Smarter Balance, which is the consortium that Oregon is in for assessment, but there's some political. So there's just because they haven't adopted currently doesn't mean they won't in the future. So there's two consortiums for assessment, okay? And the first one is PARC. So you're going to notice that it says governing state and participating state. A governing state means that they are allowed to vote on the decisions that are made for that consortium. You'll see that a participating state means that they're involved, but they don't get to have as much impact on the actual development of the standard or the assessment. So PARC, just like Smarter Balance, which is what Oregon's part of, and we'll see a picture of that in a second, applied for Race to the Top grants, and those Race to the Top grants have helped these two consortiums to be developed. These new assessments are very different than the current Oregon assessments. They are much more rigorous, and we'll show examples of those in just a second. So Smarter Balance, you'll see again, Oregon's a governing state, or often referred to as a lead state. I, for example, work on the test administration and student accessibility work group. So I actually have been Oregon's pilot test contact. I've helped develop the accessibility guidelines, and I've actually reviewed over 10,000 items that are in the bank. So that means I've reviewed them for content, accessibility, for math and ELA, as well as performance tasks. So I get to go through and I get to say, okay, this one's hitting the standard, this is the target, this is accessible for students, and the content is all accurate as well. And there's a representative from each state that's a governing state that participates that. So it's not just one state being involved. It's all of us actually looking at all of the items. And the Smarter Balance pilot test is actually occurring right now. Students in Oregon have already participated taking it. It has computer adaptive test items, and it also has performance tasks, and we'll talk about what that means in just a little bit as well. So what does this mean in Oregon? So as you can see, OAKS, the Oregon Assessment of Knowledge and Skills, we will continue to have that until the spring of 2014. The following year is when we actually switch over to Smarter. So there's not like a transition. It's just we go from OAKS to Smarter. Okay. The key thing is that when it comes to science, social science, and ELPA, we will still have an OAKS system. And we'll talk about how the science could change eventually with next generation science standards. But in general, this K through 12 students, so starting in 3rd grade, they will start taking the new Smarter Balance assessments in the spring of 2015. They're summative assessments, which means that they're given the last 12 to 15 weeks of the school year. OAKS, currently, you can start testing a student in November, and you have until May. They're all computer-based, just like OAKS, so is the performance task. But in general, you have to think about, in Oregon, we allow that bigger testing window, now trying to get every kid in those last 12 to 15 weeks. And that hasn't been completely set in stone. I keep trying to give suggestions as a former district test coordinator saying, you're trying to get that many kids into the lab, let alone instruction, let alone bandwidth, how is this going to happen? So it's something that when I go to national meetings, I always bring that up. And like I said, with Smarter Balance in general, because we're still in the pilot test phase, a lot of things have not been set in stone yet. And again, when Lisa talked about when did Smarter Balance or the Common Core start in Oregon, it started in the fall of 2010 when the State Board of Education had formally adopted them. And we adopted, obviously, both math and ELA. So we're going to look a little bit about how the Common Core ELA looks. And you'll notice it also incorporates history, social studies, science, and technical subjects. So it's not just ELA in the ELA classroom or the reading, writing component. It's also across the curriculum. So students actually have questions that deal with history, social studies, science, or technical subjects in context. When they're writing or reading, it'll have that context. They're not tested on the content of the science and the history and the social studies. All of that information is provided for them to be able to write it, but they will have to be able to use their literary skills not only in ELA type topics and formats, but also across the curriculum. There's some key instructional shifts in ELA when you look at the Common Core. One of them, and it's a huge shift, is the increase in informational text for reading. It's a 70% increase than what they're currently having in general. So yes, they're still going to have a balance of literature. So, you know, if you think back to grade school, and I think of some of the books that I read, like James and the Giant Peach, etc., they're still going to have that. But they're also going to have, for example, you're going to do research to look up a science concept. You're going to do research to look at social science and math and answer questions and write a formative or summative essay. The writing component, the huge there, especially at the high school, is the increase on argument and informative explanatory writing. So they'll be given a topic and they're going to have to look at sources of documents, and some of it's on computer, audio, video clips, or virtual websites, as well as standard written print. They'll use those sources to help them convene an argument and to show both sides of it and to make a final viewpoint of what they believe. Speaking and listening, yes, there is a component on the Smarter Balance assessment where they have to either watch a video clip or listen to an audio clip and then respond to questions, or even write a small paragraph based on what they've learned in that particular audio or video clip. The speaking component is only on the interim assessments, which are optional assessments throughout the year. They have not added the speaking component onto the actual summative assessment at this time. The language standards, the key thing there is they want to make sure that you have the students understanding what we would call general academic terms as well as domain-specific vocabulary. So if they're taking a high school chemistry course, they need to understand, what does it mean if you have chemical physical change? What does it mean if we're talking about intrinsic properties? So not just having that general academic that we often refer to, but also making sure that they have domain-specific vocabulary for science, social science, and technical subjects. And the key big change is the Common Core addresses all of these across all of the curriculums. So you're going to see more emphasis, especially in CTE courses. You're going to see more emphasis in this, even in health and PE courses in Oregon. So it's not just going to be dependent on the ELA educator. And you've heard Hilda as well as Lisa talk about CCRs. Smarter Balance has developed initial CCR definitions, or college and career readiness definitions. They also have them for math and ELA, and they've also developed initial achievement level descriptors, which tells you what a student should be able to do at the different levels of proficiency. Right now, Smarter Balance has 4 levels: 1, 2, 3, and 4. 3 is considered proficient, which means a student has met the standard. 4 means that they have exceeded the standard. 2 and 1, they're below the standard. Park currently has 5 levels. So they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4 is proficient, 5 is advanced, and they've based that a lot on the NAEP. If you've seen the NAEP alignment and ALDs and cut scores, they've aligned that to that particular part. You're going to notice also the grade level standards, especially because I know most of you are, obviously at CCWD or higher ed, and you look mainly at high school, that those grade level standards in English language arts, they're grade bands and they're broken up for 9, 10, and 11, 12. So if you were to look at the current Oregon standards, they're written for high school, all grade levels. So they've actually broken them up in rigor and what they expect students to do at the 2 different levels at high school. They're arranged by 4 strands, as we talked about: reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and they do incorporate that it's taught across all the curriculum areas, content areas. The overview of the reading strand, and you'll notice that you'll see that increase of standards for informational text. There's reading standards for literature. There's standards for reading foundational skills. But then again, if you're looking at middle and high school, there's individual reading standards for literacy and history and social studies, and reading standards for literacy and science and technical subjects. Now at the K through 5 level, those are all integrated into the actual Common Core state standards for ELA, but at middle and high, they have their own separate set. So some of the text complexity of what they do is that they actually look at qualitative and quantitative measures to determine what is that overall level of text complexity for a piece of literature. And they also look at what are we expecting that reader to be able to do with that particular piece of literature. So something like, they show an example of The Grapes of Wrath, which if you do the lexile on it is actually at the upper elementary. Yet if you were to ask an upper elementary student to understand all the connotations in it, they'd have quite a struggle. So they look at that as well when they determine the overall text complexity. You will notice that on the Common Core, in general, this is what they have done. If it is a reading passage and it's measuring on Smarter Balance Assessment for reading, it will be at that grade level. If it is something where they're asking them to do a writing piece based on the readings they just did, it will be one grade level below. So if I am a 9th grader and I'm having to do a writing component, the reading pieces that I'll be doing are at the 8th grade level, even though I'm writing something expected at 9th grade level. Overview of the writing standard, or Strand. Compose arguments and opinions, like I had talked about earlier. One of the key things is reason and evidence to substantiate an argument or claim. Conduct research, not only short projects, but also sustained inquiry where they're doing it throughout the entire year. And for those of you that are taking notes, I can email this out because I know I didn't have enough copies for everyone. So yeah, there's a lot posted. So yeah, and all the other handouts I can send digitally too. Require students to incorporate technology as they create, refine, and collaborate on writing. And one of the key components is not only sharing their information in their rough drafts in class, but also to the world. So incorporating, they may be having where they're writing letters to someone across the state or the nation even, or in another country to get feedback. And also including student writing samples. And in the Common Core State Standards, you can see in the appendix examples of the writing samples. The last components are the speaking and listening and the language. For speaking and listening, it's not just formal, but also informal speaking, as well as informal listening and active participation. You're also looking at interpretation and analysis of a message as presented through oral, visual, or multimodal formats. So there, again, those audio video clips, there's a huge technology component to Common Core as well as Smarter Balance. Language, the key thing is conventions, of course, for writing and speaking. The importance of vocabulary acquisition through a mix of conversation, direct instruction, and reading, as well as you're looking at all those components across the curriculum. The next part, and this is showing the overall standards for history and social studies, science and technical subjects, as well as writing standards for history and social studies and science and technical subjects. And this actually breaks it down, some of the key things that are required for each section. So if I'm looking for the reading standards for across the curriculum, I want them to have knowledge of domain-specific vocabulary. I want to analyze, evaluate, and differentiate primary and secondary sources, and be able to understand whether or not it's a reliable source or not. So just because you find something on Wikipedia or the internet doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be an accurate, good source for what you're trying to convey your writing with. You also want to synthesize quantitative and technical information. So that means students are expected to be able to look at maps, timelines, flowcharts, or diagrams. So if they're in a science class, for example, we expect them to understand, if they're looking at a distance over time graph, what that actually means and represents for velocity or speed, depending if there's direction. The writing standards for history and social studies and science, we want them to be able to write arguments on discipline-specific content, as well as understand what informative and explanatory texts are. We want them to use data, evidence, and reason to support arguments and claims. And again, we want them to have domain-specific vocabulary. So now we get to switch to the math side. So no offense to the ELA, math is more my passion. Okay. So some of the key instructional shifts that are happening in the mathematics. Coherence at each grade level. So one thing that happens is as it builds through the Common Core, if they've learned it in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, while they're in third grade, they obviously have new standards, but everything they've learned before is also fair game on the assessment, and so on. So obviously, if we start, you'll notice a huge shift in the Common Core that addition, subtraction, multiplication, division is a huge focus until 5th grade. Again, even if we have high school students, we still expect them to be able to add, multiply, divide, and subtract. So there's also a focus on key topics. So there's a much more in-depth relationship of those key areas of math that we expect them to be able to do. Another huge component is fluency. In the state of Oregon, currently on Oaks, a student can use the calculator on every single item that they take. Okay? In the Common Core, that isn't going to be true. There is an overall proficiency component that they are able to do basic computation. So if an equation is introduced to them the first year that it's listed as a standard, in general, they'll be allowed to have that equation to help them. So at 7th grade, for example, if I'm having the volume of a cube equation or surface area of a cube, that student will have that equation to help them. After that, they'll expect to be able to do it based on having proficiency. There are a few items where they will sometimes break that rule, but they're very high level where that's not the key focus of what they're measuring for that item, but that is a key part of that problem solving they have to use to solve the overall problem. The calculator will only pop up on some of the items on a computer. They cannot use their own calculator, and again, this is in the pilot phase. So here in Oregon, they can have their own calculator, whichever type they like, as long as it's not the QWERTY keyboard calculator, so the TI-91s, etc. It actually pops up on the screen. They're set up so that they'll do 10 items that allow them to use the calculator. Once they've done those 10 items, they have their final review, they click a button, they can't go back to fix those 10. And then they get the next 10 that either will allow them to use a calculator or won't. So they can't just write it down and be able to go back and use the calculator back and forth. That way we can measure true fluency, whether they can actually solve it without a calculator. And again, it's in pilot stage. That's had a huge discussion has occurred around that. Originally, they were not going to allow any calculators at grade 3 through 5. And since then, if they're higher level claims items, then yes, they are allowed to. But with Smarter, in general, what happens is they'll come up with a decision. It'll go, come up with a concept. It'll go out to the field, so all of the states. We will get to add our feedback, and then it evolves quickly. As I like to call it in Smarter land, things change all the time. So, and again, Hilda talked about the habits of mind. Students are expected to understand the standards for mathematical practice, and we'll look at those in a second as well. Deep conceptual understanding, there's a lot of real world application. I'm actually going to show you some sample items, and they're released, so you can use them with, they're not secure items. The ones that like I have read are secure, so I can't show you those. And then the key thing, overall increased rigor. So you're going to see a lot of the standards that we typically had at high school moving down even to junior high, and some of them even to 6th grade, or middle school, I should say. So as well as you'll see, for example, if you were to look at the kindergarten standards, some of those standards move from 2nd grade all the way down to kindergarten, what we expect in the Common Core. The grade level standards, they're K through 8, they're organized by domain. For 9 through 12, they're organized by conceptual categories like algebra, statistics, and probability, geometry. And again, we also have the standards for mathematical practice, which get incorporated, and they connect with the content in each grade. So those mathematical practices are tested based also on the content that's allowable for each grade. These are the 8 standards for mathematical practice. Make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. Reason abstractly and quantitatively. Construct viable arguments and critique the understanding of others. They will actually have problems where a student has simulated a problem and solved it and may have solved it wrong. They have to say whether or not the student is correct, as well as go back and fix the problem the way it should be. Model with mathematics. Use appropriate tools strategically, which on the computer system, they have a virtual ruler and a virtual protractor that's actually on the computer. They can't have their own ruler or protractor. It actually, they click a button, they drag it down, the ruler goes right on the item. Attend to precision, which so there's that proficiency of the fluency. Look for and make use of structure, and look for and express regularity and repeated reasoning. And I've actually made a set of posters, if you ever want to see them, that actually displays examples of what this should look like in the classroom at the different grade levels. Overview of K through 8 mathematical standards. At the elementary level, again, you're going to see K through 5. The key areas we expect are whole numbers, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, fractions, and decimals. When you get to middle school, that's when you start jumping into the geometry, algebra, the probability, and the stats. And the key thing is, especially at 7th and 8th grade, there's a huge push for significant algebra and geometry content, even more than what's in the Oregon standards by far. Students who have completed the 7th grade and mastered that content should be prepared for algebra in 8th grade or after. That doesn't mean if you have a student who has already mastered it and starts taking algebra in 7th grade, which does happen, you can still allow that student to do that. They're just going to be held to the standards that are listed for that particular grade level. High school mathematical standards. They call on students to practice applying mathematical ways of thinking to real-world issues and challenges, and they're multi-step problems. They require students to develop a depth of understanding and ability to apply mathematics to novel situations, as college students and employees regularly are called to do so. Now, this is just my personal representation, but I haven't had very many math problems in my life that were a multiple choice item, trying to solve them in my life. I was just in DC. I actually flew in 1:30 this morning, learning how to program new math simulation items for the Oregon Department of Ed for Smarter Balance assessments. And discrete math, so 331 at Oregon State, took that in 1996. I was running discrete math problems the last week, and I literally would come out going, oh, my head hurts. So there's not a multiple choice for that. Emphasize mathematical modeling, use of math and statistics to analyze empirical situations. So I used to work at, in the summertime as a teacher at the Oregon Primate Research Center. I worked in reproductive biology. And so use of stats is heavily influenced in the Common Core. And so I was always explaining to my students, they'd be like, why do I have to learn what mean, median, mode is? Why do I have to know what a z-score is? Why do I have to know the quartiles? So I'd actually show them examples of the research I was doing with the rhesus macaques, the monkeys. Identify the mathematics that all students should study in order to be college and career ready. So we want them to be able to not have to take remedial coursework. That's one thing that I was very appreciative of my educators when I was in high school, as well as the 2+2 program through Lane Community College, because I was able to take my calculus while I was in high school, instead of sitting in a huge lecture hall of 300 plus students as a freshman. Format of high school mathematics standards. So when you look at the actual Common Core State standards, they're arranged for high school by 5 conceptual categories. You'll see number and quantity, algebra functions, which is a huge push emphasis in the Common Core, and it's a huge switch from, we do have functions in the Oregon standards, but not at this level. Geometry, this is one of the areas that you'll notice that for Common Core, there's not as many geometry standards as Oregon current standards. And so there's some schools deciding that they may not offer a full year of geometry. They may have students take a half year of geometry and a half year of statistics and probability. So just something to let you to think about. Some of your students may be coming in with actual stats and probability work. Modeling standards, there's quite a few of them. You'll see a star symbol for those modeling standards of what we expect a student to be able to model in math. There's also what we often refer to as the STEM standards in math, and they'll have a plus sign next to them. They are not accessible, and I'll say this again, they are currently not accessible on the summative 11th grade assessment, because they are outside the scope of what we expect a student to be able to do to be college and career ready. These standards are what are necessary for a student to be considered ready for calculus, discrete math, and advanced statistics. Those standards will also be found in many other courses that students are taking, chemistry, physics, CTE-based courses, or even economics. And again, we want them to all students to be having those experiences. I'm just saying that they're not going to necessarily be assessed on all of those at the 11th grade year. So the Smarter Balance assessment has 2 components. One is a computer adaptive test, so it ramps up or down depending on how a student is performing. Similar to the OAKS system, it's actually currently the same testing vendor that we have here in Oregon, so AIR, where I was at in DC. So a student logs in, they get a couple first questions. Depending on how they respond, it either ramps up to harder questions or lower questions, as well as it can go up and down the entire process. So we're going to look at a couple sample items. Now this one, I know it's not as creative because you can't actually see the article, because at the time they released this, they had not gotten the copyright yet. But the students would actually have to read the article, Planes on the Brain, and basically it was talking about how on an airplane there's quite a bit new technology that actually can detect the black boxes and can detect if someone was not doing something appropriate or the pilot was having issues, etc. And they have to be able to type into the box their own student response. So this is a constructive response item. How does the author emphasize the point that the TAM program was a positive influence on their sisters' lives? Use details from the text to support your answer. So they're having to look at what they've read, formulate and understand that into a written response, as well as use data from that and details from that actual written piece of literature. And so in Oregon, on our actual reading test, we don't have items that are like this. So this is a brand new to Oregon students. This item, for example, is you would think it's a reading item, but it's actually a writing item. And this item is asking students to look at this information and revise the paragraph by adding details from the daily schedule that helps support the reasons for having a longer school day. So they're actually going to add on to the paragraph that's up above in the box, as well as support a reason that a longer school day should happen. Again, in Oregon, for our current writing assessment, the students have either a booklet that they have 3 or 4 possibilities to choose from, or they can also take it online currently. They get a topic and they have to write no more than 1,500 words, the current writing. So, assessment in Oregon. Smarter Balance, on the computer adaptive test, they're going to have quite a few of these. So this, again, is a huge shift for Oregon. In this particular paragraph, the invasion of kudzu, the following paragraph is an excerpt from a student's report about plant life in the southern United States. After reading the paragraph, you will identify details that are unnecessary and explain why they should be removed. In the space below, identify the sentences from the paragraph that are unnecessary and briefly explain why each one should be removed. So they're not just cutting them out. So what they can do for this item actually is, it's called a hot text item. They actually click on the sentences that they think should be omitted. It makes them green colored, so it looks like they've highlighted them. And then down below, they actually explain why they think each one should be removed. So they get two different scores. One for the sentences that they have actually highlighted, and another score for their actual constructive response at the bottom. Yeah?
Can I ask, how is that going to be scored? Will the grading actually look at the logic of their answer, or is it using prompts such as sentence construction or vocabulary?
So will you repeat the question?
I will. So she's wanting to know how the AI scoring or the human scoring is actually going to look at someone's logical response. And when you look at the top part, so when they actually highlight the hot text part, that part's actually machine scored. So you set up behind and you determine, here are the ones that they should have removed. And it's behind the scenes. The student can't see that. So I'm someone that actually programs these for the state of Oregon. I actually set up and say, okay, these are the ones that should be removed. I set up the code behind the scenes so that way if the student selects them, then it scores that part. You're referring more to the bottom part, so the constructive response. The constructive responses at this time are going to be human scored currently. Eventually they're looking to look at artificial intelligence or AI scoring. Again, because we're in the pilot phase as well as then we'll do the field testing, they have to do additional calibrations. So they actually have student responses, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of student responses that they actually score human. They also score, they feed those into the computer so they have a baseline of what a score of, let's say, a 1, 2, 3, and 4 represents. They then calibrate based on what the humans would have given it as well. So it's not just going to be all, put it into a computer, here's what the computer says. Eventually, due to cost, because human scoring is very expensive, just like our Oregon writing assessments are all human scored, and for example during spring break we'll have hundreds of teachers in Oregon across the state that are scoring student writing responses. What happens is they have to make sure that AI scoring is comparable, because sometimes what will happen with some AI scoring, if it's not done correctly, is that you'll get very few at the one extreme. Let's say the score is 1 to 6. You have very hard extremes of the 1 and 6, and they all get kind of pushed in the middle, and it's very hard to distinguish if someone is right at that 3, 4, and 4 is proficient and 3 isn't. And then they would have to be back read by a human, because even with our Oregon assessments currently, when they have 2 teachers read them, if those 2 teachers are not within 1 score from each other, they get a third read by an expert, such as Ken Herman's our ELA specialist. So he actually goes through, and if there's some that got 3, 4 splits, he goes through and a human actually makes that final decision. Currently with this Smarter Balance pilot, they don't have the AI set up completely yet, so they're all being human scored. Yeah?
What mechanisms are in place already align instruction with the expectations and outcomes of this specific exam? Or how are educators being notified about how specific their duties have become?
Rachel, make sure you repeat the question.
I will. Sorry. Habit. So what he was asking was how are Oregon educators being notified of these expectations as well as what's changing in the classroom? I'm assuming that's what you mean. Yeah. So one thing that happens is that each month, for example, I do a Smarter Balance presentation. They're all WebEx. They're all archived, as well as all the trainings. What you're seeing right now is actually part of a presentation, parts of it, that I've given to K-12 educators already. So they've actually been giving these items to use in their classrooms. They've actually started using the rubrics that go with them. They've actually, now again, I want to refrain when I say this. Most, and I have to say this loosely, most schools have shifted to Common Core. Not all schools have. Not all classrooms have. And Hilda would agree with me in the sense that there are educators who think they have shifted to the Common Core because, oh, we've done this so many years before and this looks similar, and it's not. Yeah. So one thing that also happens is anything that we get from the department, it all goes out on our website, like releasing items, putting out the rubrics. Every time something new comes up for Smarter Balance, we have what's called the Assessment and Accountability Update that goes out weekly. All that information with all the links goes to every educator who wants to sign up for that, as well as administrators.
Sounds like it's all voluntary. Teachers are already somewhat overwhelmed. I mean, they face an army of students unprepared for our first generation of this test.
Well, and that's why what's happened currently with the Smarter Balance pilot test that's going on. Smarter Balance randomly selected a demographic sample of schools to participate this year. But if you were not picked for that, any school and any class, even an individual educator was able to volunteer to participate in the non-scientific sample. That way kids could see them. So what we do is after those items are going to be used, they will be released as a practice test. And they already have practice tests online for students to practice that parents can go on and students can go on. So even if a parent, for example, is very concerned that their student hasn't had that experience, they can actually log in. They can take items just like this. Now, this particular constructive response, when they hit the score button up above, it's not going to score it because it would be human scored. But what comes up is a rubric, and it shows you an example of sample student work and what score they got. Yeah.
I'm wondering, you said you're the one who picks the sentences that should be left out.
Well,
you said you're the one who picks the sentences that should be left out. And I'm wondering, what's the double check on that? Because I can imagine the fact that you pronounced it kudzu makes me know you're not from the South, where it's called kudzu.
Right.
And that I'm wondering whether a teacher or a student with different regional background might think different. I mean, I can't read it from where I'm sitting, but I'm just wondering what's the double check on the person, you or whoever, who's selecting what should be left off?
What I can tell you is that with each item, like I had said, there's one person from each person in the consortium, and we do have southern states in the consortium. So obviously, no, I'm not from the South, so I apologize. My dad is; he's from Arkansas, but anyways, all of that is double checked, and they also have vendors who also double check as well. So it gets multiple levels of review. It's not just my review. It's not, I'm just one person that when it comes to the math, they have me check tons of the content and accessibility. So I can, here at the department, I can do the programming behind. So I get a list of, here's the sentences I would like to have that can highlight. I go back through and do the computer programming to make it do that. So like I said, Oregon currently is involved in an item writing program where we have 25 educators in Oregon that are writing items for the Smarter Balance field test and operational assessment. I'm in charge of the math, and then Ken Herman's the ELA specialist. They've been writing items. So writing items. I know that sounds weird. Those items, even though they get looked at by a panel of writers here in Oregon, they go through an accessibility, sensitivity, and bias review. They go to Smarter Balance. They go through an entire another level of review with the vendor, and then there's also the executive committee that goes through all those items as well. So it's not just me. I'm one level. Yeah.
I have a question, and maybe thank you. And maybe this is a question for Hilda instead of you. But some of the implications that you're speaking about have, I can see, relate to teacher education and the requirements in the university of our teachers who are there now. Who is working with the state universities to make sure that the preparation for middle school or 3rd to 8th grade teachers includes such things as probability, statistics, etc.? Thank you.
Sure. So Lisa actually had me talk at OCATE, which is the Oregon Council of Teachers of Ed, and Hilda was there as well. So they're very aware of the shifts as well. And so there's 2 different levels when I think of teacher prep. So you have pre-service program, and then you have already people that are out in the field that needs continuing professional development. When it comes to the teacher prep, when I gave the presentation to the OCTE group, they're very aware of Common Core and the changes. So those current teachers that are in those, I can't say all, okay, but quite a few of those educators currently in teacher prep programs, they're getting quite a bit of this whole focus on Common Core, Smarter Balance, etc. They're not getting a huge focus on the current Oregon standards, because by the time they get into the classroom, their focus will be on Common Core and Smarter Balance. So they get intensive, I can't say all, but a lot of them get intensive. I actually saw some of the work that they're doing with their teachers of having them align curriculum to it. When it comes to ongoing professional development, that is the area that, depending on the district and what funding they have, as well as we have been, and again, I know funding, okay, having been in the fields for 13 years. That is why we have tried as much as we can at the department with the funding that we have to provide as much professional development. A lot of it has been WebEx's. It also has been regional at ESDs to go out and give presentations, because there's not, if you see at the department, people always think, oh, it's the Department of Essential Skills. There's 4 of us, okay? Assessment, 2 of those same essential skills are in assessment, so we double do parts of it. So we've tried to do as much as we can. So we can't, do I think currently, and I know this is going to sound bad, do I think the educators are getting everything they need? No. I've been out there. Because there isn't a ton of funding for professional development. And so there has to be, and that's something that Hilda could talk about with the OEIB, one of their goals is to have more professional development funding. And part of that teacher effectiveness, one of the cool pieces of it, and I wish when I was in the classroom this had happened, usually my professional development at a lot of the districts I worked at, before I went to Eastern Oregon, it was a huge group. We'd have one speaker coming to talk to all of us about one topic. Now that new teacher effectiveness program, it's supposed to be prescriptive per educator for their plan. So if you need someone that needs to learn more classroom management, their professional development will go that way. If you need someone that needs to learn more Common Core, they should be able to choose their professional development in that sense. So I think you're going to see with the teacher effectiveness, if you get a chance to look on the OD website and you can actually look at the rubrics of what they're going to be scored for, the different areas, that professional development isn't just going to be what I like to call the spray and pray and hope it sticks. It's going to be more individual for each educator. And by doing that, it's, I think, going to be more beneficial than, oh, everybody go to the cafeteria, everybody go to the library, we're going to have this one, training where, oh, you were supposed to read these pages before you went in, and you have people that do, and then you have others that don't. So, and I understand about the whole overwhelming. It's one thing that people ask why I left the classroom. I love the kids. I love teaching. I love doing the labs and everything. I wanted to be able to go out and help educators and say, look, I understand it's going to be stressful. It's going to be a change. But that's why when I actually go into classrooms and help educators at the district level and show them, okay, here's what you're doing currently. What can you do to make it more Common Core or smarter? Or you think this is a Common Core task. What is it really Common Core level task, and what could be improved? So, yeah.
So, obviously all of us know that there's not enough money for FPD.
Right.
We certainly, I
belong to one of the organizations in the state, the Oregon Writing and English Advisory Committee, and we've been asking for years to get money so that we can actually do alignment work with high school teachers. Can I ask how much we're going to be paying for Smarter Balanced Assessment each year? Isn't it over $5 million a year?
And I'm not just saying this because I work for the department. That would be a question I would have to ask Doug Costi to get the final numbers for.
Isn't it about $20 per test, though, and we have approximately 550,000 students in the state?
Yes.
Okay. So have we ever in the history of the state spent $5.5 million on faculty professional development?
I can't answer. I understand. I am a messenger.
The other, we only have about 10 minutes left, and I want to give Rachel opportunity to get through the remainder of her presentation. But I just want to say that this is also an opportunity for all of us to think about how the post-secondary sector can work to support those teachers in K-12 and how we can develop new models for what professional development looks like. This is part of the opportunity that all of this presents. I realize that it's a big challenge, but it's also an opportunity. There's lemonade to consider in all of this, which is that by working together, we can overcome some of these challenges.
Right. Thanks, Lisa. So this item, for example, is a listening item. They actually watch the video clip called Exercise in Space, and then they have to do a constructive response item related to it. And it says use 2 details from the video to support your answer. So even if they understand about gravity, they have to they could type that in, but if it doesn't tie back to what they've actually learned from the video clips, then they wouldn't get the correct score. And I've had questions about, what happens if you have a student who's hard of hearing? They're all going to be closed captioned as well. Eventually they will also be brailled items. They also, for sign language, for example, they'll be using, it's an actual human little video clip of the person signing it. It's not an avatar. So they're looking into quite a bit of accessibility for the items. And we've seen that. So on to some math ones. Here's one, for example, and again, this is a screenshot, so you won't be able to see the actual little video clip. But you can go on the Smarter Balance website and look under sample items, and you can actually go in and take the sample items assessment and actually see the video. It says a construction worker is using wooden beams to reinforce the back wall of a room. Determine the height and feet of the beam that ends at point G. Explain how you found your answer. So not only are they having to find their answer, but they're also having to explain how they got to that answer. And again, that would be a human scored response because it's constructive response. Here's another example for high school level, dealing with the 2-second rule. They have to actually explain. As part of your explanation, include the minimum following distances in feet or cars traveling at 30 miles per hour and 60 miles per hour. So most kids at the high school level, we hope, are wanting to learn and get their driver's license, driver's permit. So they do try and do real world situations that students will face throughout their life. Here's an example of a statistics and probability-based question. It says, what is the greatest amount Tyler should spend on advertising each month? Show your work or explain how you found your answer. Here's an example that I like. It has a science context. The noise level at a music concert must be no more than 80 decibels at the edge of the property in which the concert's held. At the end, it says Rachael claims that the noise level, and there's the scenario, at the edge of the property is no more than 80 decibels since the edge of the property is over 4 times the distance where Melissa is standing. Explain whether Rachael is or is not correct, and they actually have to explain. They can't just say yes or no. Again, another data analysis problem where they're actually having to calculate and explain which car will cost Tony the least to buy and use. This is the other biggest shift, and I'm going to have to kind of go fast, and I realize that. You each have examples at your table of some performance tasks, and these are the performance tasks that are the multi-sectional piece of the assessment. So before it was a computer adaptive test. The student logs in, they go through the items, and it ramps up or down. This is a sample set of performance tasks. You have 2 of them. One's on nuclear power, one's on crickets. So the ELA example for 11th grade, and again, this has been shortened down. There's much more in the actual packet. Students refer to their notes as needed to compare it because they actually see some video clips. They have a class discussion on this type of energy source. They're allowed to access the stimuli, the video clips, the research. They get to take notes and they have a class discussion. They do a pre-writing, drafting, and revisions are involved during their writing piece. The scored product, a student responds to the constructive response research question at the end of part 1. So that means that after they've done the research, they have a set of questions they have to respond to in written form. And the essay completed in part 2 will be scored. Notes completed in part 1 and pre-writing and drafting in part 2 will not be scored, but they will need to use those. And that's actually all included in that the student is told ahead of time, so there's no surprise. This is the actual prompt that's in the book, or the booklet. And again, this is taken on the computer as well. So they've done all the research, they have a scenario, they've taken it to a congresswoman, and she says, I don't have time to meet with you, basically. Come up with your argumentative report that recommends the position that your congresswoman should take on the plan to build a nuclear power plant in your state. Support your claim with evidence from the internet sources you have read and viewed. You do not need to use all the sources, only the ones that most effectively and credibly support your position and your consideration of the opposing point of view. And in those packets, you can actually see the rubric of how the work is scored. The example that they have showed, and these are released ones. There's many more that are being tried out on the pilot test currently, but these are released ones that have been used in classrooms here in Oregon. In this case, they're having to understand the mathematical relationship about the amounts of chirping a cricket can make in regards to temperature. And again, I have to go kind of quick, but you can see they're having to ask students to determine how converting to Celsius would affect the interpretation instead of Fahrenheit. Collect all the different formulas available for predicting temperature based on the number of cricket chirps, so there's a research component. Discuss similarities and differences, for which values of the independent variable are the different formulas more and less discrepant, assumes the same variables and measurement units. Seek global understanding of why data can lead to different formulas for the same phenomena. They go through and they look at the Dolbear model and see, based on their model versus his model, which one is more accurate when they set up the equation. They plot the line that represents Dolbear's law on the same graph as the one that they have set up their equation from their research. What are the differences between this model and the one you developed earlier? Support your conclusion using 4 data points. Why do you think these differences could occur between different equations? And again, this is a short. There's much more if you look at the actual task. The other thing I wanted to show you is that the Next Generation Science Standards, Oregon is a lead state for that as well. You can actually get a free release on the framework. The actual standards document itself will be finished by mid-April 2013, and Cheryl Kleckner and myself will determine, based on stakeholder feedback, whether or not we should take this up for state board adoption this next year. The cool thing about the Next Generation Science Standards is all of them are linked to Common Core, ELA, and math standards. So they're all tied in. And I can't go through all the shifts, but they're listed there and they're in the packet as well. But one of the key things is that they're not written as standards, they're written as performance expectations, what we expect a student to be able to do in science and engineering, as well as there's a huge focus on not only understanding content, but the cross-cutting concepts, as well as the science and engineering practices tied into each of those performance expectations. And we'll go back to questions in a second. But what I was saying earlier is each month since October, there's been a Smarter Balance WebEx where you can ask questions, you can get those, the actual PowerPoints, the handouts, the sample items. You can actually find them if you go on the Oregon Department of Ed website under Common Core State Standard Web Events, and you can find all that information that's posted. So the next one that I have is in April, but I'll actually be a Next Generation Science meeting. So someone else will be conducting the Interim Assessments and Formative Tools one. And you can ask, it's a WebEx, they actually let you do the polling, you can ask questions throughout the whole thing. I've listed a bunch of resources. For those of you that want to see more sample items or actually go in and play with the items, I've listed the link. The General Smarter Balance website, you can find the ALDs, the College and Career Readiness definitions. You can look at sample items and performance tasks as well as the rubrics and sample student responses. We also have on the ODE website the Common Core State Standards Toolkit and the Common Core State Standards Assessment Resources page. So all the information regarding the pilot, the field test, and what is actually processing at that point. Because everything, like I said, changes quickly. Within a 2-week span regarding that calculator philosophy, that's how fast it changed. So keeping up to date. I've also listed contact information. Karen Marangella from the Oregon University System is the higher ed lead for the state of Oregon for Smarter Balance. Doug Costi is the K-12 K-12 lead for Oregon regarding Smarter Balance. I listed Lisa, myself. Derek Brown's the manager of Essential Skills. Mark Freed does math curriculum. Ken Hermans is ELA assessment and SBAC. Cheryl Kleckner, science curriculum, Common Core State Standards and Next Generation Science Standards. And Kathleen Vanderwall is the manager of test design. So if you have questions about how much it's going to cost, general expectations, Kathleen is someone that you can email in regard to that, or Doug Costi. And it's just doug.costi@state.or.us. And we'll go back. So, thanks.
All right. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah.
I guess this is more a request. I see on the performance tasks, when you ask the students to do research, what you seem to be measuring is their ability to incorporate outside sources rather than their ability to do real research. It would be very simple to provide a link and limit it by IP address to the statewide research databases that we already pay for. So why not provide students the authentic task of researching? This would cost the state absolutely nothing more. It's a simple programming task, and incorporate that into their writing assessment.
And that's a good idea.
Rachel, will you repeat the?
Oh, sorry. So he's wanting, sure. He's wanting to know how come when they're looking at, for example, the research, why they're virtual websites and they're not actually going out to a real. Part of that has to do with the fact that in the assessment system, because it's on the computer system, if they were to go out to a real website, they can cut and paste from that into their document, and possible plagiarism, and that's honestly why. Unlike the controlled ones, they can't actually cut and paste from it. They actually have to take the notes that's part of the task. Yes?
But my understanding, so one of my biggest concerns is that one of the skills that students really struggle to master is the ability to paraphrase and summarize and attribute information. And it's actually a skill that takes years and years for students to master. And the way that these tests are set up, there doesn't seem to be a check to determine, well, there's a check to determine if they plagiarize, if they've taken exact language, but there's not necessarily a check to determine if they have borrowed an idea and not credited it, or if they have misrepresented an idea and not credited it, unless we're using human scorers all the time who are able to have access to all of the source material and who have read it. It's actually one of the challenges of teaching research is that in order for a teacher to really give appropriate feedback to students, they have to read every single thing the student looks at. And so when I went online and looked at some of the exemplary writing samples, what I found is a great deal of patch writing, and which to me, those shouldn't be exemplary samples if they are riddled with what's called patch writing, which is when students take part of somebody else's language and mix it with their own. And so my fear about this is that the test isn't actually going to be able to measure whether or not students can put things into their own words, which is probably the most complicated skill that we're going to ask them to master.
If I can tell you that I feel the same way. When I go to meetings and I address to them that I am that same concern, it is being discussed, I can tell you that. And I'm not just giving you lip service. What I'm saying is that there has to be, and I know Lisa and I have had conversations, especially around the AI component. It's very, very controversial. It is not set in stone at this point. It is brought up all of the time. It's something that's being discussed not only with higher ed faculty, but also K-12 have similar concerns as well as we at the department. Because, for example, when an Oregon writing sample is scored, if there were those materials, every grader would be given those materials to know what they had ahead of time. How does a computer be able to see all those materials and be able to then understand? And it is a concern. And here's what I can say. If you have those types of concerns, on the Smarter Balance website, they have a higher ed drop-down portal, and there are places where you can send concerns. The other thing you can do is if you have a general concern, you can email it to me, and then I can also send it on to Smarter Balance as well. And I do that all the time. For example, when we had the calculator, I had given a presentation to our advisor on special education in Oregon. They sent me tons of feedback. I sent it right to Magda Chia, who's actually in charge of special ed and ELL populations in Smarter Balance, and that's how I got the conversation started around the calculator. So it's very much here's what I have learned in general, is if there's a group consensus of a strong consensus on something, and there's an actual email that has multiple people that have the same concern that goes to them, they listen. They will listen to individuals, but if there's an overall concern from a larger group, it seems to have more weight. So that would be my recommendation. Yes.
All right. Let's take one last question,
last
and
question.
then let's go to a short break.
Yep. Yes.
I was just wondering, I don't know much about this.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. When students take these tests, how it's scored, is it like ABC or proficient or not proficient? And if they don't do well enough, do they retrain? Do they take it again? What are the ramifications of those results?
Okay. So it depends on what grade level they are. For example, if it's grades 3 through 8, because it's a summative end of the year course assessment, if you think of it in that sense, what happens is those interim assessments that they can take throughout the year, that's supposed to actually help the educator see whether or not a student is ready to take the summative at the end of the year. What happens sometimes here in Oregon, quite often, is with the OAKS system, because they can have multiple attempts, you have kids that get baselined day 1 in November when they've had literally not even, we start school in September, some in August in Eastern Oregon. Some of those kids have not even had mastered the material yet, they're being baselined on an assessment. And then, they haven't met it, then they'll take it again. Or you have kids that have met and exceeded, and they'll be told by, they're so close to exceeding, we'll have them take it again. With the interim, the cool assessments is a teacher can go in and say, okay, I have taught about this certain set of standards. I can go into that system, I can pick items that align to those standards that I actually just taught about and want to see where my students are. They take the assessment, they get instant feedback on the computer adaptive items. Then they can go into what's going to be called the digital library. Digital library has best practices, it has resources, lesson plans, ideas that teachers can use to help get those students that need to be, I hate the word remediated, I hate it, to help them get up to the standard, to be ready to take that summative. If the students at the high school level, and this is up to each state in the consortium, so it hasn't been a consortium-wide decision, if they don't meet proficiency by 11th grade, yes, they'll be able to take it again their senior year. Just like here in Oregon, we allow students that haven't met by junior year to take it again their senior year. When you look at the scoring, they get a RIT score for each component. That RIT score is combined, and the test specification and blueprints, you can actually look at the initial draft ones on the Smarter Balance website. It actually shows you what percentage of each category is present on their overall score and how they get that 1, 2, 3, or 4 overall. So I can't, if I was to explain all the math that's involved with the equations to get to that, it would take quite a bit of time, but it's all listed on the test specs. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yes. Here's what I can, I'll repeat it. So she asked about socioeconomical status. Yes. So even when they're doing the pilot test right now, and they did demographics, they actually looked at different subgroups, ELL populations, SES, etc. That is all taken into consideration, just like with OAKS. We can look at, are the students that are actually the high poverty schools performing, or students outperforming low socioeconomical versus high socioeconomical, etc. That's part of Magda Chia's job at Smarter Balance, is to make sure that when we write the items, we actually have to make sure that they go through an intensive bias and sensitivity review, so that a student who could be from a higher socioeconomical status doesn't have additional advantage over a student that doesn't, because they may not know a certain topic, or they may not know, be familiar with a certain item, for example. The other thing that happens in your second question, I apologize, if you could rephrase that again. Oh, passing. So here's what has happened at this point. Because it's an essential skills requirement, And a lot of this still has to be determined by the state board. If they were not able to pass a Smarter Balance math or ELA, what may happen, and I have to say may because the state board has not made the final decision, is that they would be able to show that proficiency similar to they can now for Oaks, where they'd be able to have work samples, or they do a couple of the performance tasks. They may be able to show it with the work keys, the compass, PSAT, SAT, ACT. Again, those decisions have not been finalized yet. We have to wait because remember, we're still in the pilot stage of the test. So until we get to the actual operational and we get cut scores and we know what a student has to be able to do to become proficient, it's kind of hard to make those decisions at this time.
Thanks, Rachel. And thank you all of you for your questions.